Sick of getting blisters? Stop slipping and just be comfortable with Pure Grip Socks Pro. Great fit, great comfort, lots of grip, and an even better price. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
One of the biggest complaints focused around the new Phantom GX2 and Luna 2 is that there's a little bit too much inspiration taken from the original Luna, which wasn't particularly well received. While I think they are overall really solid football boots, the one thing that I think most people would change about the new Phantom GX2 and Luna 2 was the decision to carry over the sole plate and stud pattern from the original Luna rather than the original GX. But what if I told you you can get exactly that? Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Nike Phantom GX2 Elite in the AG variation, which, as you can see, carries over the exact same sole plate and stud pattern from the AG version of the Phantom GX. You can also get this, of course, on the mid-cut Luna 2 as well, effectively correcting the main issue that so many people have with this new generation of Phantom, all for the same retail price of $260 for the low-cut GX2 and $285 for the mid-cut Luna 2. And while this technically is their AG sole plate made specifically for use on artificial grass, as you can see by the overall design, it is very usable as an FG firm natural grass stud pattern as well. So with that in mind, given that the sole plate is kind of the base of every football boot, is this sole plate and stud pattern that much better than the Luna sole plate and stud pattern that everyone's complaining about? With both the AG and the FG variations of the new Phantoms being available below their normal retail prices by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the links down below. Before we get into the stud patterns, I want to talk about the sole plates themselves because they do offer differences in terms of underfoot feel as well as overall flexibility, where the standard FG sole plate taken from the original Luna is a little bit thicker, a little bit firmer, and maybe gives you more of that speed boot type of springback effect. But in general, I wouldn't say that it's really a standout compared to other top-end boots on the market, and honestly, not some of Nike's best work. I was on the same bandwagon of suggesting that the original GX sole plate and stud pattern would have been better for this new generation, but I do think this feels better than what was featured on the original Luna, and that some of the awkward flexing that you had with that football boot doesn't seem to be an issue on this new one. Nonetheless, on the AG version of the new Phantom GX2 or Luna 2, you're getting basically the same sole plate construction as the original GX with this kind of zigzag pattern that overall is a little bit thinner and just more flexible overall, which I think works quite nicely with the super soft and sock-like feel of this new grip knit upper. I just think it makes for a more natural feel to the boot itself, where again, personal preference is a huge aspect of what I'm talking about here. If you prefer a slightly stiffer sole plate, you'll probably like this one a little bit more than this one, but for those of you that like that more kind of natural sensation to the feel of your football boots, I do think this is better. When it comes to the traction provided by both of these stud patterns, there are obviously some big differences between them, given the fact that they are ultimately designed for two different types of playing surfaces. However, for this being an AG specific stud pattern, it's obviously going to perform great on artificial grass. It's a very similar layout and design from what we've seen in past Nike AG layouts, where you have that rounded shape to the stud with the hollowed out core from what used to be a relatively soft rubber, but at this point it's pretty firm. There's no real flex to these studs anymore. The hole in the middle is just to create a little bit of relief when the entire weight of your body is pressing into the ground, digging these studs into that artificial grass surface, where the idea behind the rounded shape in general is to still allow your foot to twist and pivot while still giving you really good traction. The dangers of wearing, say, a bladed stud on artificial grass is that when this blade with this solid hard edge digs into the ground, you lose that freedom to twist and pivot, which means you're going to try to pivot, and instead of moving at the foot, you're going to break at the ankle, the knee, or the hip, which can actually result in some very serious injuries. So if you do play on artificial grass and you're interested in this new generation of Phantom, for sure 100% regardless of sole plate preference, go for the AG variation. With that said, even though it's not something that Nike necessarily markets, this AG stud pattern is as FG-AG as just about anything out there right now, in that you'll notice the layout of the studs is pretty well the same as an FG stud pattern. And if we even compare it to the FG version of the original Phantom GX, you can see the positioning of the studs is identical. The only difference is that instead of having these kind of three-sided bladed studs in certain points of the stud pattern, everything is rounded. So you can almost look at this as a more rounded take on the Nike Tiempo stud pattern, which is FG and is something that nobody would really think twice about wearing on natural grass. The actual length of the studs are also pretty well identical to the FG model. So in terms of the traction provided, if you want a more aggressive bite, obviously the bladed studs of the regular FG model is going to provide that a little bit better. Whereas if you prefer that little bit more of a traditional feel, again, that freedom to twist and pivot because of the rounded shape of the studs, you might prefer this AG one on natural grass. Again, it's totally a personal preference thing, but for me personally, I just much prefer the feel of the sole plate and the traction provided by the stud pattern of the AG model versus the FG one. Something else to note between these two sole plates is that they're not exactly the same width. Both boots are formed around the same last, so the base shape is pretty well identical. However, you will notice, and it's difficult to show on video, side by side, the toe box is a little bit wider and slightly more square on the AG variation versus the slightly sharper and pointier design of the normal FG variation. We'll talk about it more in just a second when we get the boots on feet, but it is worth noting that the AG model is a little bit wider and more rounded in shape through the toe box. And then there's the weight. Exactly the same upper, but different sole plates and stud patterns. Which one is lighter? Both in the same size 9.5 US. We'll start off with the FG model, and you can see that they weigh in at a lightweight 6.95 ounces, the equivalent of 197 grams. Remember those numbers, and we'll throw on the AG model, and you can see that they weigh in at 6.8 ounces, the equivalent of 193 grams. So a very small difference, only 4 grams between the two, but technically pound for pound, or I guess in this situation, gram for gram, the AG model is just that little bit lighter. On feet, just to rehash what was already mentioned earlier in the video, there are two main differences in terms of the fit and feel between the FG and the AG variations. Number one is that they're technically the same shape. However, because the shape of the AG sole plate is a little bit wider and a little bit more rounded in the toe box area, you do get a little bit of extra width towards the front of the football boot, which for me personally is something that I prefer. The second difference that you're going to notice is, again, the sole plate of the AG variation being more like the original GX, or basically the same thing, is a little bit more flexible, which again, I prefer. That difference is relatively subtle, but the width difference is pretty undeniable. Beyond that, the uppers are exactly the same. Lockdown and fit through the heel is identical, and of course, they're both wide enough to be suitable for the vast majority. Again, the AG version is just a little bit wider towards the front third of the football boot. Also, when it comes to sizing, I'm wearing both of these boots in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So regardless of which one that you go for, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, while I don't necessarily think there's a bad choice between either the AG or the FG variation of the new GX2 or Luna 2, I will say that depending on personal preference, one might be significantly better for you than the other, or at the very least, you'll like one more than the other. If you prefer bladed studs, a slightly stiffer sole plate, and will exclusively be using the boots on natural grass, by all means, go for the FG model. Whereas if you prefer a slightly more flexible sole plate, rounded studs, and will be using the boots both on natural and artificial playing surfaces, in my eyes, it's a no-brainer. Go for the AG model.